Hello, chess friends, and welcome to Zarov's chess channel, and welcome to the Airthings tournament in 2020, which is now, I think, a very cool event for us to watch in the next couple of days. 12 players are participating, among them also the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So the setup is like this: we will have 12 players, then one round robin will be played. So after 11 rounds, we'll then know who is moving up to the quarterfinal stage. Then we'll have a knockout stage, and I think we'll have really good games because Magnus Carlsen in this tournament will play against these three players that managed to win match games against him in 2020, which are of course Hikaru, Nakamura, Wesley So, and also Maxime, Vachier-Lagrave. So I think some really cool and dynamic games we can expect. And today we're starting this tournament with a really great gameplay by Magnus Carlsen against Levon Aronian. Here Magnus played with the white pieces and opened with the move d4. So Aronian responds with knight to f6. We have c4, e6, and knight to f3, the counter Nimzo-Indian setup. We have d5. So far the queen's gambit declined. Knight to c3, and now bishop to b4. So the bishop to b4 is the so-called Ragozzi variation. We're playing on this absolute pin idea, very active bishop we have here, pinning the knight on c3, and Magnus goes now c takes d5, which is also really my recommendation because there is really a great tension here all over the board. First of all, we have the tension in the center, then we could have a further tension with the move knight to e4. So sometimes it's good really to undermine the pressure in the center. So c takes d5, perfectly fine. After e takes d5, Magnus goes now into this bishop to f4 line. So if you try even bishop to g5, it's also playable. When I play against the Ragozin, I tried the bishop to g5 line, but it's very aggressive. After h6, bishop to h4, g5 could be played, bishop to g3, and now knight to e4 is, I think, a very intense and really messed up position for both sides. It has really great tactical opportunities, but still it's playable for both sides. So here after the move bishop to f4, Magnus Carlsen plays most of the times this line. He played it against Anish Giri and also against Alireza Firouzja, I believe, in this year. So he doesn't want this pawns to attack the bishop further, so that's why bishop to f4 so far perfectly fine. And we have c6 by Aronian, fixing the pawn structure around the square d5, and we have e3. Bishop to f5, that's the good part about the Ragozin defense, because we have now great activity with both of these bishops. That's why you have to, I think, attack one of these bishops. Magnus plays it with the move queen to b3, really attacking now the bishop. One of these bishops has to be removed, because if you allow your opponent to stay with this kind of an active bishop pair, I think you have really a bad game, because also there are some threats. Knight to e4 and then queen to a5 are serious threats that you have to handle. This bishop is perfectly fine here on this diagonal and this one too, so that's why Magnus challenges immediately one of these bishops. After move queen to b3, queen to b6 was played, and now knight to h4. Again, Magnus continues with his ideas, simply attacks the bishop. In the game, bishop to g3 was played by Aronian. If you try bishop to g4 to stay active with your bishop, then h3 could happen, bishop to h5, and then knight to f5. Then you have to castle, and I think this moment white can use and develop his bishop on a very active square. It's of course now the square d3. So that's why after the move knight to h4, Aronian goes bishop to g6, gives up the bishop pair. Magnus takes, knight takes g3, h takes g3, and now h3, which is very important because we want to have also some breathing spaces for the bishop. The bishop needs this long diagonal, and now comes knight from b to d7 by Aronian. What black wants to do is, of course, keep the position compact somehow, maybe even further cement the position around the square e4, but it has to be prepared. Still, you have some troubles where to castle with black. If you castle too early in some occasions, then white could simply try to push the pawns h5, g4, h4, g5, really try to break the position all over the board. So that's why it's very risky. You have to wait, I think, here from black's perspective, first white to castle and then maybe to castle on the same side. If you castle too early, I think you could have some trouble. So bishop to d3, we have c5. Aronian breaks the position in the center. He creates further tension around the square c3. But there is one problem of this move. It's this isolated pawn situation, which happens many times in Queen's Gambit declined, maybe Nimzo-Indian defense. It's really in many of these d4 openings. You can risk sometimes to be left with his isolated d pawn. So the main idea to create when you play against isolated pawns is to create a blockade, or that player that has the isolated pawn has to advance, has to try to advance the pawn somehow. In the game, the Magnus plays now a3, kicks away also this bishop. We have bishop to a5, and now Magnus trades off the queens, queen to b6, bishop to b6, and now d takes c5. Here Magnus goes now into simplified line, wants to trade off more pieces, wants to simply go onto this isolated pawn strategy. After knight to c5, he goes queenside castling. Even if you take knight takes d3, okay, maybe you'll solve the problems of the bishop pair of whites, but still, I wouldn't love to be black here, because this isolated pawn, I think, is simply too much to handle now. We can double up rooks, even if you defend it somehow. If you play d4, it's not a possibility. We can simply take. That's why I think, as I said, taking the bishop on d3 is not a good option here. So that's why Levon also queenside castle. That was, I think, a good choice not to castle here kingside, because if we castle here kingside, let's go back, then we would have sort of an opposite side attack game, where black and white are trying to attack the king as fast as they can, and I think with the bishop pair, then white is much better. White will find good games with his bishop. So after queenside castling, as I said, Aronian plays also queenside castling. We have king to b1, improving the position of the king, securing the king further, but also opening here maybe the file for the rook. We can play rook to c1, and maybe rook from h to d1 is also a nice strategical idea. So here knight to e6, attacking the bishop. We have bishop to e5, bishop to c7, and now bishop takes c7, king to c7, and now bishop to c2. The problem is now, this is a very good move by Carlsen, because he realized that this d4 move, which seems like a good idea to advance our isolated pawn, which was our main weakness in the position, is not possible. It's not possible to push the pawn on d4. You get e takes d4, maybe knight to d4, but now rook to d4, rook takes, and you get a very nice fork, knight to b5, and it's game over. So after the move bishop to c2, Aronian continues with g5. We have bishop to b3, attacking further the d5 weakness in the game, king to c6. Protecting the d5 pawn, and Magnus goes now rook to c1, because he wants to create, of course, some further attacks against the king. The king is now really weird here on c6, so there are really some great attacking opportunities here. White is much better in the game. King to d6 was played, and now Magnus goes knight to b5. A better idea here for white is to play rook from h to d1, and you cannot protect this pawn anymore. You force basically to play king to e7, and I think we can simply take and go into a favorable endgame. But this knight to b5, it's still a good move. It's not a problem that this is losing somehow for white, or that you don't have any more a better position. It's of course good, but this idea rook from h to d1 I think was slightly better. Knight to b5, attacking of course the king. We can also take the pawn on a7, but you see now the problems. After king to e5, we can take the pawn, that's not the point, and after knight to e4, we lose another tempo to get our knight back. That's, I think, a huge difference between this line and that line that with the move rook from h to d1. Okay, still a good position here for white. White has grabbed the pawn, because the problem of black here is that you cannot take the pawn on f2. After knight to f2, we can play rook to f1. You have to again retreat, and we can take out now this pawn. So that's why it's hard for Aronian to include this knight into the game. In the game, after the move knight to b5, Aronian tried a different path. He tried g4 to open the position somehow on the h file. In the game, Magnus played rook to c2, finally protecting everything. Now, if you try maybe h takes g4, it's not a good choice, because we'll simply play knight to f2. Here, after rook to f1, we can also take out this pawn. And if you go for this one, then we can, I think, take out this one on e3. And this could be playable here for black. So that's why rook to c2 played by Magnus. But you lose also a little bit your connection with your rooks. The rooks in such games have to be compact, have to be connected somehow. Rook to c2, still a better position here for white. In the game, rook to h5, we have f3, finally attacking here this knight, this very annoying knight on e4, and here After g takes f3, we have g takes f3, and now knight to g3. We have rook to d1, attacking further our main goal. It's of course the weak d5 pawn. It was the whole strategy of whites was simply built around the square d5. In the game, knight to f5 was played. If you take rook to h3, immediately it's not good because you get simply bishop to d5, and after something like rook to d5 you get a very nice move f4. You get deflected from the defense of the rook because you have only one square, it's the square e4, but then you get knight to c3, you get the fork, and you will lose your rook. So that's why taking the pawn is here not an option here. Levon Aronian played the accurate move, knight to f5. Still a better position for white, but at least he has regrouped now. Black pieces are a little bit glued together, they're compact, so it's really hard for white to win this position. You have to be really accurate in the game. Magnus tried now rook to c3, protecting his weak e3 pawn, and now knight to c7, knight to e7 and knight to c7 played by Magnus. We have g5, and now knight takes e6. F takes e6, Magnus attacks the knight. We have rook to c7, and now knight to f5. Here, e4 played by Magnus, attacking the knight and also the pawn on d5. You cannot take, there is this tension on the d file, so that's why here knight to d4 played by Aronian. Very nice move, locking the d file, very important, and get our knight very, very centralized. You cannot play f4, you cannot deflect this king from the defense. Very important pawn also here, the g5 pawn. So rook to b7 played by Magnus. We have rook to h3. A better choice, maybe instead of this rook takes b7 by Magnus, is to play rook to c3. We want, I think, here to regroup. We want to at least create some kind of a compact position, because what happened now in the continuation of the game after rook to b7, okay, now Aronian takes, rook takes h3, we have d takes e4, but Aronian could have played something better here. Instead of this rook to h3 line, he could have played here simply d takes e4. And after maybe something like f takes e4, here now we can take rook takes h3, and you see now we have a double attack here by the rook and the knight against the bishop on b3. And then we can maybe take out this pawn and still continue the game with two pass pawns here. White has also maybe two pass pawns, but I think this would be a draw. But Aronian makes a mistake. He plays the move rook to h3 immediately and allows now Magnus to take e takes d5, which is now a huge difference. After e takes d5, you see now still we're continuing the game with this isolated pawn, and I think we have protected this pawn at least for a while now, because rook to e7 was played by Magnus, king to d6, and now rook to e3, protecting finally this pawn. You see the knight is also hanging. If you take with the knight, then we have rook to d5, is also very risky. So that's why here Aronian undermines the pressure, takes out this very annoying bishop, because the bishop is targeting always the weak d5 square. We have rook to b3, and now rook to f8, rook from d to d3, and now Levon Aronian plays rook to f4, forcing really this blockade, never allow this pawn to get advanced. In the game, Magnus tried king to c2. He's trying to improve, of course, his king. It's now an endgame stage. You have to play very active with your king. And we have now king to e5. We have rook to b5 attacking the pawn. And now comes really, really huge blunder here by Levon Aronian. Here, rook to d4. Very, very bad move, because there is one move. You can pause the video. And what's the winning move here for white? Okay. The winning move is of course f4, first a check and you will lose your rook, but fortunately for Levon Aronian, Magnus missed this move, which was really incredible. After move rook to d4, Magnus took rook takes d4, we have king to d4, and now after rook to b3, this is basically a draw's position. It's really hard to win this rook and pawn endgames. Rook to h2, we have king to b1, again a check, king to a2, here by Magnus, we have king to c4, rook to c3, king to b5, and now king to b3, but still we have a very nice move here by Aronian. He knows how to play now this drawish line d4, very important move, because it deflects now a little bit the rook from the c file, and now the king can come on this very important square, king to c5. Magnus goes now king to c2, but now rook to g3, a4, now first a check, and now rook to g3, rook to f2, protecting the pawn, king to b4, b3, of course, played by Magnus, protecting the pawn, but now g4, very, very important move, opens now the position here. We cannot target this. This is the most important pawn that we have to take, is the weak b3 pawn. In the game f takes g4, we have d3, king to d2, and now Levon takes out this pawn, king to d3, first to check, rook to g3, and we can take rook to c3, rook takes b3, king, rook to b2 after trades of rooks, and king to a4. It was a draw. So incredible stuff. Magnus missed his win with his move f4. He had, I think, a good position. Great game he played against the Ragozin. Levon had some troubles to activate his pieces. You saw this isolated pawn situation, how risky it can be sometimes in chess. But okay, as a warm-up, I think it was a very, very cool game, very instructive setup by Magnus against the Ragozin. We're starting now to follow this tournament. I'll create also a separate playlist, so you can also analyze some further games that we'll try to cover in this very cool tournament. If you want to see some other tournaments that I've covered so far, check out my commented chess game series. Here's the link. And if you want to see maybe the humans battling in their best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. And if you want to see maybe the engines playing, check out my best chess games played by the engines, best chess games played by computers. Here's also the link. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.